In October 1943, Nazi Germany issued orders for the complete arrest and deportation of every Jew in Denmark. 7,800 people marked for the concentration camps. But when the Gestapo arrived to execute the roundup, they found empty apartments, abandoned businesses, and entire neighborhoods evacuated overnight. Nearly 7,200 people had vanished across the Øresund strait to Sweden. The Germans knew where they went, they just couldn't stop the fishermen who took them there. This isn't a story about grand resistance movements or military operations. This is about 5 ordinary men who spent their lives reading weather patterns and fishing grounds, who suddenly found themselves navigating the most dangerous waters of the war, not against storms, but against patrol boats with mounted guns and crews ordered to shoot on sight. Benjamin Jakobsen, Mikkel Olsen, Jens Eriksen, Jeppe Koch, and Andreas Berg didn't have training in espionage or combat. They had fishing boats that reeked of herring, intimate knowledge of every current and fogbank in the Øresund, and a simple conviction that their neighbors, Jewish families they'd known for decades, were not cargo for German deportation trains. Over 3 weeks in October 1943, these 5 men would make crossing after crossing, hiding families beneath fishing nets, timing departures between patrol boat rotations, using darkness and fog as their only protection. They charged what refugees could afford, sometimes nothing, sometimes their life savings, and they kept fishing through it all, because the moment they stopped fishing was the moment the Germans would know something had changed. This is the story of how ordinary expertise became extraordinary courage, and how 5 men who knew the sea better than any German officer turned those waters into a corridor of escape that the Third Reich, despite all its machinery of surveillance and violence, could never completely close.
WWII occupied a particular geography that would prove consequential in the autumn of 1943. The fishing village sat on Denmark's northern coast, where the Øresund Strait narrowed to its most crossable width, 25 kilometers of cold water separating occupied Denmark from neutral Sweden. On clear days, Swedish lighthouses were visible from WWII's harbor, a constant reminder that safety existed just beyond the horizon if one possessed the means and knowledge to reach it. 5 men knew these waters with an intimacy that comes only from lifelong immersion. Benjamin Jakobsen, at 45, was the eldest, a widower who had inherited his father's fishing boat and spent 30 years learning how the Øresund's currents shifted with seasons and tides. Mikkel Olsen, 43, possessed an almost intuitive ability to read weather patterns, often predicting fog banks and wind changes hours before they materialized. Jens Eriksen, 44, served as the community's marine mechanic, keeping aging boat engines operational through improvisation and technical ingenuity that German replacement parts shortages demanded. Jeppe Koch, 40, was the youngest boat captain among them, known for taking calculated risks that more cautious fishermen avoided. Andreas Berg, 35, had studied navigation formally before returning to fishing, bringing theoretical knowledge to complement the others' practical expertise. These men were not political activists or resistance operatives. They were fishermen who had grown up knowing many of WWII's Jewish families, the Segals who ran the textile shop, the Goldsteins who operated the pharmacy, the Rosenbergs whose children attended the same schools. When occupation came in 1940, life continued with the sullen normalcy that characterized Denmark under German control. The fishing boats went out, the catches came in. The German garrison stationed in town showed little interest in maritime operations, beyond ensuring that fishing vessels didn't stray too close to military installations. By September 1943, this equilibrium had persisted for 3 years. The 5 fishermen maintained their routines with practiced efficiency, departing before dawn, working the same grounds their fathers had worked, returning with catches that sustained the village and supplied German requisitions. They gathered most evenings at the harbor's small boathouse, drinking coffee and discussing weather, engine troubles, and the depleted herring populations that forced them to range farther for diminishing returns. None of them suspected that within days, their knowledge of currents and fog patterns, their ability to read the sea in darkness, and their coordination developed through years of working the same waters would be tested in ways that had nothing to do with fishing. The Øresund they knew as a source of livelihood was about to become something else entirely, a narrow corridor between survival and deportation, where their expertise would be measured not in catches brought home, but in lives carried across.
The warning arrived through channels so circuitous that its origin remained unclear even after the war. On September 28, 1943, a German diplomat, later identified as George Ferdinand Dukwitz, leaked information to Danish political contacts about orders issued from Berlin. The entire Jewish population of Denmark, approximately 7,800 people, would be arrested beginning October 1st and deported to concentration camps. The operation would be comprehensive, coordinated, and executed with the efficiency that characterized German administrative actions. Within hours, the warning spread through networks of telephone calls, hurried visits, and urgent messages delivered by trusted intermediaries. In Copenhagen, Rabbi Marcus Melchior interrupted Rosh Hashanah services on September 29th with words that shattered the fragile normalcy Danish Jews had maintained under occupation. There would be no service the following day. The congregation should go home immediately, contact every Jewish family they knew, and disappear before the Gestapo arrived. The warning reached Gillele that same evening. A local pastor received a telephone call from a contact in Copenhagen, and by nightfall, the village's small Jewish community, perhaps 30 people, had been quietly informed. But information traveled through other channels as well. Benjamin Jakobsen learned from the harbor master, who had heard from a railway worker, who had overheard German officers discussing increased military police deployments. By 10 o'clock that night, the 5 fishermen had gathered in Jens Eriksen's boathouse, not for their usual coffee and weather talk, but for a conversation that would define everything that followed. Andreas Berg laid out what they knew. German orders for mass arrests, Jewish families already fleeing Copenhagen, heading for coastal towns where fishing boats might offer passage to Sweden. The Gestapo would watch the harbors. Patrol boats would increase surveillance. Anyone caught transporting refugees would face immediate execution. The silence that followed was not hesitation, but calculation. Each man understood what was being considered and what it would cost if they failed. Benjamin spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had already made his decision. The Segels asked if I knew anyone with a boat. I told him I'd think about it. I finished thinking. Mikkel Olsen nodded slowly, then asked the only practical question that mattered. How many can we move before they shut down the harbor? They spent the next 3 hours planning logistics with the same methodical attention they applied to fishing expeditions. Routes that avoided patrol boat patterns, timing coordinated with tides and darkness, communication signals between boats, the careful maintenance of normal fishing routines so German authorities wouldn't notice any operational changes. By dawn on September 30th, 1943, 5 fishing boats that had spent decades harvesting herring had been quietly repurposed as vessels of rescue, and 5 men who knew the sea had committed to navigating the most dangerous crossing of their lives. The first crossing. The Segel family arrived at Benjamin Jakobsen's boat just after midnight on October 2nd, a couple in their 50s with their adult daughter and her husband. They carried one small suitcase between them, having abandoned everything else in their apartment above the textile shop. Benjamin showed them where to position themselves in the hold, beneath layers of fishing nets that still smelled of the day's catch. The nets would provide cover if searchlights swept the boat, though everyone understood that any serious inspection would discover them immediately. Mikkel Olsen had spent the evening studying weather patterns and reported favorable conditions, moderate fog developing after 2 a.m., enough to obscure visibility without becoming thick enough to ground all maritime traffic. The German patrol boats maintained predictable rotation schedules, passing the northern harbor exit every 45 minutes. Benjamin's departure window opened at 2:17, giving him approximately 30 minutes to clear the coastal zone before the next patrol circuit. The engine started with its familiar diesel rumble, a sound Benjamin had heard 10,000 times, but which now seemed impossibly loud in the darkness. He maintained normal throttle speed leaving the harbor. Too fast would appear suspicious. Too slow would miss the window before the patrol boat's return. The sails remained motionless beneath the nets, understanding that any movement or sound could betray them. Once past the harbor breakwater, Benjamin adjusted course to 035 degrees, not the direct route to Sweden, which patrol boats monitored heavily, but a longer path that followed traditional fishing grounds before angling northeast towards Swedish waters. The fog developed as Mikkel had predicted, reducing visibility to perhaps 50 meters. This was both protection and danger. Searchlights couldn't penetrate the fog easily, but neither could Benjamin see patrol boats until they were dangerously close. 20 minutes into the crossing, he heard the distinctive engine signature of a German patrol boat, a higher-pitched note than fishing vessels produced. Benjamin maintained his course and speed, hands steady on the wheel despite his accelerating pulse. Appearing to take evasive action would confirm guilt. The German patrol boat's searchlights swept through the fog, perhaps 100 meters to starboard, illuminating water but finding nothing. The engine noise gradually faded as the patrol continued its circuit. The crossing took 93 minutes. When the Swedish lighthouse at Höganäs finally appeared through the thinning fog, Benjamin felt something release in his chest that he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The sails emerged from under the nets as Swedish coastal patrol boats approached, not with guns drawn, but with instructions for landing procedures and refugee processing. Benjamin watched them disembark onto Swedish soil, 4 people who would survive the war because a fishing boat had temporarily stopped catching fish. Then he turned back towards Denmark, towards the harbor where more families would be waiting, and towards the realization that this crossing was not an ending, but a beginning.
The question of payment emerged during the second week of operations, when the scale of the rescue effort became clear and the fishermen confronted realities that moral clarity alone could not resolve. Boats required fuel that German rationing controlled. Engines needed repairs that cost money the fishermen didn't have in reserve. Families arrived asking for passage, some carrying jewelry and cash, others with nothing but the clothes they wore. Benjamin established the practice that the other 4 adopted. He asked what people could afford, accepted what they offered, and never refused passage based on inability to pay. A wealthy merchant family from Copenhagen paid 2,000 kroner for their crossing, enough to cover fuel and repairs for a week. An elderly couple from the countryside offered 50 kroner and a pocket watch that belonged to the husband's father. Benjamin took the money and returned the watch. The moral complexity deepened when other fishermen, not part of their group, began offering passage at exploitative rates, 5,000 kroner per person, 10,000 for families. These opportunists recognized the desperation of people facing deportation and priced accordingly. The 5 fishermen found themselves in the impossible position of competing with price gougers while trying to maintain both their rescue operations and their own financial survival. Andreas Berg proposed a system that balanced necessity with conscience. They would charge those who could afford market rates, use that money to subsidize crossings for those who couldn't, and maintain a network of safe houses where refugees could wait until weather and patrol schedules aligned favorably. The pastor's home became the primary coordination point. His wife, Karin, organized families into groups sized appropriately for each boat's capacity, prioritizing those at immediate risk, people named in Gestapo lists, families with members already arrested, refugees who had been hiding for weeks. The safe houses developed along the coast in a pattern of quiet conspiracy. A farmer's barn 3 kilometers from Gilleleje, a fisherman's cottage in the neighboring village, the church attic where families could wait in relative comfort rather than hiding in cold storage sheds.
Each location had a coordinator who watched for German patrols and sent word when conditions allowed movement to the harbor. By mid-October, the system functioned with efficient coordination born of necessity. Mikkel monitored weather. Jeppe tracked patrol boat schedules. Jens maintained all 5 boats in operational readiness. Andreas coordinated with safe houses and determined which families would attempt crossing on which night. Benjamin, as the eldest, made final decisions of risk, when fog was sufficient, when patrols were predictable enough, when conditions justified the gamble. They moved between 8 and 12 people most nights they operated, spacing crossings to avoid establishing patterns German observers might detect. Some nights they charged nothing. Some nights they collected enough to sustain operations for a week. The moral mathematics never balanced perfectly, but it balanced enough to continue. And continuation meant more lives carried across water that separated deportation from survival by 25 kilometers and 90 minutes of navigation in darkness. Kapitänleutnant Franz Keller had commanded the Naval Patrol Division in the Øresund since March 1943, long enough to develop an intimate familiarity with the maritime rhythms of the occupied Danish coast. Before the war, he had studied marine engineering in Hamburg and spent summers sailing the Baltic. He understood fishing operations not as a military officer observing suspicious activity, but as someone who recognized when patterns deviated from their established norms. The first anomaly he noted in his patrol logs during the second week of October. Fishing boats were departing in weather conditions that experienced fishermen typically avoided, moderate fog that reduced visibility without being thick enough to ground all traffic. Keller knew that fishermen generally preferred clear conditions or stayed in harbor during fog. Yet 5 specific boats from Gilleleie, he had learned to recognize them by their registration numbers and distinctive hull markings, seemed to favor precisely these marginal conditions. The second anomaly concerned catch reports. German occupation authorities required fishermen to document their catches for rationing purposes. Keller cross-referenced these reports with departure logs and noticed something peculiar. These 5 Gilleleie boats were reporting consistent catches during a period when other fishing operations across the Øresund showed significant decline. Either these 5 fishermen possessed extraordinary skill, or they were engaged in activities that had nothing to do with fishing but required the appearance of normal operations. On October 12th, Keller positioned his patrol boat near the northern harbor exit and observed evening departures through binoculars. Benjamin Jakobsen's vessel left at 2:15 a.m., moving at standard throttle speed, running lights properly displayed, every aspect of its operation appearing routine, except that Benjamin departed alone, without crew, which was unusual for night fishing. And the boat sat lower in the water than an empty fishing vessel should, suggesting weight distribution inconsistent with fishing equipment alone. Keller did not immediately report his suspicions to Gestapo authorities. He was a naval officer, not SS, and he had witnessed enough of occupation's brutalities to feel increasingly ambivalent about his role. Instead, he increased patrol frequency and observation, documenting patterns with methodical precision. 5 boats, departures timed between patrol rotations, routes that initially followed fishing grounds before angling toward Swedish waters, return trips completed before dawn, the boats riding higher, emptied of whatever cargo they had carried outbound. By October 15th, Keller had compiled enough evidence to confirm what he suspected. Gilleleie's fishermen were running refugees to Sweden with systematic regularity. The question that kept him awake was not whether to report this information, but whether he possessed the courage to pretend he hadn't noticed. His duty required him to shut down the operation immediately. His conscience suggested that some duties deserved to be failed. He made his decision on October 16th, entering a notation in his patrol log that the increased fishing activity reflected Danish fishermen compensating for poor catches through extended operations. It was a lie transparent enough that any serious review would expose it. But Keller had observed enough of the war to understand that sometimes the most important act was choosing which truths to report and which to bury in bureaucratic language that suggested competent observation while enabling deliberate blindness.
By the third week of October, the rescue operation had evolved into a technical discipline as precise as navigation itself. Mikkel Olsen maintained a handwritten chart documenting patrol boat movements with the meticulous attention of someone tracking weather systems. The German vessels followed predictable patterns, 3 boats rotating through 6-hour shifts, each completing a circuit of the northern coast every 45 minutes. The mathematics was straightforward. A fishing boat departing Gilleleia needed 17 minutes to clear the high-surveillance coastal zone. This left a 28-minute margin before the next patrol circuit, assuming no delays and no deviations from routine. But the mathematics became complicated when variables accumulated. A headwind added 3 to 5 minutes to clearing time. Fog thick enough to provide cover also slowed navigation. Refugees unfamiliar with boats sometimes shifted weight unexpectedly, requiring course corrections. Each variable consumed minutes from an already narrow margin, and the penalty for miscalculation was discovery, arrest, and execution. Jens Eriksen addressed one critical vulnerability through mechanical modification. The fishing boat's diesel engines produced a distinctive low-frequency rumble that differed noticeably from the higher-pitched sound of German patrol vessels. This difference allowed fishermen to identify patrol boats by sound alone in darkness or fog, but it also meant German crews could potentially identify fishing boats by the same acoustic signature. Jens modified exhaust systems on all 5 boats to muffle the diesel rumble, reducing detection range while maintaining operational power. The modifications took him 3 days of 16-hour work sessions, improvising with materials that wouldn't raise suspicion if German inspectors examined the boats. Andreas Berg developed the communication system that coordinated multiple boats operating on the same night. Simple lantern signals, 1 flash for patrol boat detected, 2 flashes for all clear, 3 flashes for abort operation. The signals used fishing boat running lights, indistinguishable from routine navigation to distant observers, but clearly readable to fishermen who knew what to watch for. This allowed the 5 fishermen to function as a networked operation rather than independent actors, sharing threat information in real time without radio communication that German monitors could intercept. The escalating risk became apparent on October 19th when Gestapo officers appeared at the Gilleleia harbor conducting random inspections. They examined boat registrations, questioned fishermen about recent catches, and searched holds for contraband. Benjamin was at sea during the inspection, but Jeppe Koch's boat was searched while still docked. The Gestapo found nothing suspicious: fishing nets, equipment, the pervasive smell of herring. But their presence signaled that German attention was focusing on coastal operations. That evening, the 5 fishermen gathered in Jens's boathouse to recalculate risk. Andreas laid out the situation with characteristic directness. German surveillance had intensified. Patrol boats were varying their routes slightly, introducing unpredictability into what had been reliable patterns. Gestapo inspections could discover refugees hidden in boats at dock. The mathematical margins that had seemed adequate 2 weeks ago had narrowed to the point that a single miscalculation would result in catastrophe. Yet families continued arriving, and Sweden was 25 kilometers away, and the question was not whether to continue, but how to continue with sufficient precision to survive. Jeppe Koch departed on October 21st with a family of 4 hidden beneath his nets, trusting Mikkel's weather forecast and Andreas's patrol boat schedule. The forecast was accurate: moderate fog,
gentle northeast wind, visibility reduced to approximately 40 meters. But the Øresund possessed variables that no amount of experience could perfectly predict, and on this night, an unexpected current pattern would nearly destroy everything they had built. Jeppe was 19 minutes into the crossing, navigating by compass and the sound of water against his hull, when he felt the boat drift, not dramatically, but enough that his practiced sense of position told him something had changed. The current that normally ran parallel to his route had shifted, pushing him south and west, directly into the patrol boat corridor he had planned to avoid. He corrected course immediately, but the current persisted, stronger than he had encountered before. Within minutes, he heard the sound he had been trained to dread, the higher-pitched engine note of a German patrol boat, growing louder, approaching from the direction his drift had carried him. Running would confirm guilt. Maintaining course would bring him directly into the patrol boat's path. Jeppe made the only decision available. He cut his engine and began deploying fishing nets, transforming from a boat in suspicious transit into a boat engaged in legitimate fishing activity. The patrol boat's searchlight found him within seconds, illuminating his vessel in harsh white light. A German voice called out in accented Danish, ordering him to remain stationary for inspection. Jeppe raised his hand in acknowledgement, his heart rate accelerating, while his hands continued the practiced motions of managing fishing nets. Beneath those nets, the family lay absolutely still, understanding that any sound or movement would end not just their lives, but the entire rescue operation. The patrol boat came alongside, close enough that Jeppe could see 3 German sailors clearly, young men, perhaps 20 years old, equipped with rifles and flashlights. An officer, older and more seasoned, examined Jeppe's boat registration and fishing permit, while one sailor swept a flashlight across the deck. The beam lingered on the piled fishing nets, moved to the equipment locker, returned to the nets. "You fish alone at night?" the officer asked, his tone suggesting suspicion rather than curiosity. "I've fished these waters for 15 years, Jeppe replied, his Danish steady despite his terror. "I know where the herring run. I don't need crew to find them." The officer considered this, then gestured toward the nets. "Show me your catch." This was the moment that would determine everything. Jeppe moved to the nets with deliberate slowness, pulling back one section to reveal the fish he had actually caught earlier that day, kept cold in the hold for precisely this possibility. Perhaps 8 kilograms of herring, enough to be plausible, but not impressive. The officer examined the fish, noted their freshness, then looked at Jeppe with an expression that might have been acceptance or might have been something more calculated. "Continue your fishing," he said finally, "but stay out of the shipping lanes." The patrol boat's engine engaged, the searchlight swept away, and within a minute the German vessel had disappeared into the fog. Jeppe waited 5 full minutes before restarting his engine, his hands shaking now that the immediate danger had passed, and completed the crossing to Sweden with currents that had finally returned to their expected patterns.
The warning reached the harbor at 8:47 p.m. on October 6th. Gestapo units were surrounding WWII Church, where approximately 80 refugees had been sheltering in the attic for 3 days. German trucks were already positioned at the church entrance. Within minutes, those people would be arrested, loaded into vehicles, and transported to assembly points for deportation. The 5 fishermen were preparing their boats for routine night operations when the pastor's wife arrived running, breathless with urgency and terror. Benjamin understood immediately what she was asking, not whether they could attempt a rescue, but how quickly they could coordinate one under circumstances that made failure almost certain. The church was 4 blocks from the harbor. German searchlights were already illuminating the building. Patrol boats would be alerted within minutes. Every aspect of their careful system, timing, secrecy, calculated margins, had collapsed into immediate chaos. Andreas made the assessment that would define the next 2 hours. "We load everyone, all 5 boats. We leave together. We use the shallow channel." The shallow channel was a route the fishermen knew from decades of local navigation, a passage that ran northeast from the harbor through waters barely deep enough for their fishing boats' draft. Patrol boats with deeper keels couldn't follow, but the channel required precise navigation in darkness, and a single boat running aground would block the entire passage. What followed was coordination achieved through years of working the same waters. Benjamin and Mikkel took their boats directly to the church's rear entrance, positioning at the small dock normally used for deliveries. Jens, Jeppe, and Andreas created a diversion at the harbor's main entrance, starting their engines and flooding the area with running lights, drawing German attention and patrol boat searchlights towards what appeared to be normal fishing departure activity. German soldiers discovered the evacuation 12 minutes into the loading operation. Searchlights swept toward the dock. Commands were shouted. Benjamin heard rifle bolts being cycled. He started his engine, Mikkel did the same, and both boats departed simultaneously into darkness, while Jens, Jeppe, and Andreas accelerated their diversion, drawing patrol boats away from the harbor entrance with the appearance of vessels fleeing toward open water. Benjamin navigated the shallow channel by memory and sound, the change in water tone when depth decreased, the specific angle required at each turn, the narrow margins that separated passage from grounding. Behind him, patrol boat searchlights swept the water, but the German vessels couldn't pursue into depth their keels couldn't navigate. Mikkel followed Benjamin's exact path, trusting decades of partnership to maintain spacing in complete darkness. The crossing took 2 hours instead of the usual 90 minutes, the overloaded boats moving slowly through water that offered no margin for error. When Swedish lights finally appeared, Benjamin counted 80 people emerging from the holds, exhausted, terrified, but alive, because 5 fishermen had abandoned every principle of caution for one principle that superseded calculation. When people need rescue, you attempt rescue, regardless of odds or margins or the mathematics that suggest failure. The rescue operations continued through late October, though with increasing difficulty as German surveillance intensified and the pool of refugees still waiting diminished. By November, most of Denmark's Jewish population had either reached Sweden or been arrested. The 5 fishermen made their final crossing on October 28th, carrying a family of 3 who had been hiding in a farmhouse for nearly a month. After that, the risks no longer justified the attempts, and the boats returned to fishing exclusively. Liberation came to Denmark on May 5, 1945, brought to British forces and the collapse of German occupation. The 5 fishermen were among thousands of Danes who had participated in various forms of resistance, their specific contributions documented by the Danish Freedom Council but not widely publicized. Andreas Berg received a commendation for his coordination work. The others declined formal recognition, preferring to return to the routines that the war had interrupted. Benjamin Jakobsen continued fishing until 1959, when arthritis made handling nets impossible. He spent his final years repairing boat engines and teaching navigation to younger fishermen. He rarely spoke about the October crossings, though occasionally visitors would arrive, families who had made it to Sweden and wanted to thank the man who had carried them across the strait. Benjamin received them with quiet courtesy, accepted their gratitude, but never claimed heroism for actions he considered simply what neighbors did when neighbors faced deportation. Mikkel Olsen maintained his weather journals until his death in 1967, the notebooks filled with decades of observations about currents and fog patterns. Researchers later discovered entries from October 1943 that contained no mention of rescue operations, only technical notations about unusual current behaviors and fog density measurements. The silence was deliberate. Mikkel had learned during the war that some knowledge was best preserved without context. Jens Eriksen's workshop became a gathering place for retired fishermen who wanted their engines maintained by someone who understood the old diesel systems. He worked until 1972, his hands still capable of the precise adjustments that had once modified exhaust systems to reduce detection range. Jeppe Koch, the youngest of the 5, lived until 1981.
In his later years, he occasionally gave interviews to historians researching the Danish rescue operations. He spoke factually about patrol boat schedules and navigation challenges, but when asked about the emotional weight of the work, he said only that the sea had always demanded precision and courage, and that October 1943 had simply extended those demands into domains where fishing expertise became relevant to survival. The 5 men had operated for 3 weeks in October 1943, using fishing boats to move people instead of herring. They had charged when refugees could pay, transported for free when they couldn't, and saved 127 lives through navigation skills developed over decades of reading currents and weather. The Øresund returned to being simply water after the war, but for those 3 weeks it had been something else, a passage between worlds where expertise in fishing became expertise in rescue, and where 5 ordinary men demonstrated that courage sometimes manifests not in dramatic gestures, but in the quiet application of knowledge, when knowledge becomes the only thing standing between people and deportation.
The story you have just heard is inspired by the documented rescue of Danish Jews in October 1943, though Benjamin Jakobsen, Mikkel Olsen, Jens Eriksen, Jeppe Koch, and Andreas Berg are fictional composites representing the many Danish fishermen who participated in these operations. The rescue itself is historical fact. Between September 28th and October 31st, 1943, Danish fishing boats transported approximately 7,200 of Denmark's 7,800 Jews to neutral Sweden, achieving a survival rate unprecedented in Nazi-occupied Europe. The warning from German diplomat Georg Ferdinand Duckwitz, Rabbi Marcus Melchior's Rosh Hashanah announcement, and the Gestapo raid at Gillelig Church on October 6, 1943, are all documented historical events. Technical details about Øresund navigation, German patrol boat operations, and the use of shallow channels inaccessible to military vessels are drawn from historical accounts and maritime records. The moral complexity regarding payment for passage reflects historical reality. Some fishermen charged exploitative rates, while others transported refugees for free or modest fees. Gillelig served as one of several primary escape points, and the village's fishing community played a crucial role in the rescue operations. While these 5 specific fishermen are fictional composites, their story honors the documented courage of Danish maritime communities who transformed fishing vessels into instruments of rescue, and used their intimate knowledge of local waters to save thousands of lives during 3 desperate weeks when expertise in navigation became the difference between survival and deportation. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of courage and moral complexity from history's darkest moments. Your subscription helps us continue sharing these important narratives. Thank you for watching.